Great. Diane, thank you so much for being with us today. It is a real treat to have you here. I have been a big fan of yours for many, 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 many years. And my first question for you is really, given the current sort of environment in which we live and the bifurcations that we see across our culture, what are you hearing and picking up out there as you continue to do your work?
For me, being here is such an inspiration. It reminds me always of how important it is to be peaceful, to be quiet, which is hard to do of late because we just got now a 10-week-old puppy who kept us up all night long. But that's all right. Being here is inspirational. But how do I function? How do I perceive what is happening in this world? I think that Roseanne is a perfect example of what's happening in this world. The need to create what in Arabic we call aj'a, which is confusion, a mess, a creation of conflict. And then something else happens. And there is a reaction to that. In my case, what I am trying to do now in the podcast and through a documentary on which I am working. I was out in California all last week filming a documentary on the right to die, which after my podcast, but first I'll put my husband, my little dog, I find peace and quiet as soon as I walk into our home and try to find equilibrium there in the face. I've never in my life, and I was on the air about 40 years, hosting this show for 37. I have never, in all these presidents we've seen come and go, seen such terrible turmoil.
You know, in those 37 years of hosting your show, you sat with thousands of people.
Yes.
And I was always amazed at your ability to sit in the middle of conversations that were sometimes they were two-sided, sometimes they were three-sided, and to sort of work that conversation. Share with us some of your secrets of what it means to be a good listener. How does one do that as an honest broker for all those years? Were there certain things that you always paid attention to, or certain guidelines that you always tried to follow, because you were an honest broker and continue to be an honest broker for so many people, for so many different kinds of conversations?
You know, listening for me doesn't happen just through the ears. Listening happens when you watch body language, when you look in the eyes of someone, when you truly, truly open your heart and hear with every ounce of your being. I remember striving so hard when Donald Trump came into office, hearing those people who support Donald Trump and trying to understand to the best of my ability what it is that was lacking in our politics that they felt Donald Trump represented. It's hard. It's hard for me. I am a lifelong Democrat. I continue to speak out on issues that I care about, but I know I must be educated by listening to those who feel otherwise. And I strive as hard as I can to watch Fox News, to watch MSNBC, to watch CNN, but most of all, frankly, to listen to National Public Radio. Because there I do get worthwhile news.
I think it was Henry Nouwen who once said that listening is a kind of spiritual hospitality. And I think that's a great line. You know, he said that, you know, when we listen, we open up ourselves to the possibility of being changed.
I love his writings.
You know, when we argue, we're trying to win our point. If we're really listening to someone, we are being vulnerable to that person. And one of the things I feel that's lacking in many places in our, at least the sort of public culture we see on television, is a lack of deep listening to one another. That concerns me, that we're all trying to make our next point. You know, we're all trying to get across what we think or to correct someone else, as opposed to listening to their story, listening to where they're coming from. And I think that's so deeply important. I was watching I don't know how many of you all may have seen the documentary about John McCain that was on HBO. I guess it was Sunday night it came out. And what was fascinating to me, besides so many things about his wonderful life and the great things that he's done, was how many friendships he created across the aisle and how deeply they knew and respected one another, even though they would vehemently disagree on points. It was the relationships, the knowing one another's stories that seemed to cross those boundaries.
You know, my producers have told me that John McCain was on my program 7 times. And one of the last times he was on was shortly after the United States went into Iraq, which I totally, vehemently disagreed with. So I challenged him, but I listened to him. And at the end of the program, he said to me, "Diane, I know you don't agree with my perspective, but thank you for listening." He's a great listener and a great sharer of ideas. He holds firm to those in which he believes, and clearly has been an outspoken critic of this president, who, I must say, insulted John McCain in such a way that broke my heart.
The spirit of meanness sometimes that exists in our culture these days is very troubling to me, and sometimes it comes from all angles and all different directions.
But how about you? How do you experience that meanness?
Here we go.
That sense of conflict, even within this glorious cathedral?
Well, it's interesting. You know, here we try to be a place, a house of prayer for all people. And so we see folks coming. There were folks here after the election. We held a number of services and had the cathedral open after the election. And there were those folks who were quite overjoyed about the election and the new President Trump. And there were many people in tears here walking through the cathedral and quite in a panic about the fact that Trump had been elected. And what I thought was really important for us is that we be here and be available to people who both were celebrating what our nation was doing and those who were mourning what our nation was doing. What was so noticeable to me was that how visceral it was on both sides. And I worry that we are beginning to limit people to their political identities, as opposed to seeing beyond those identities. I mean, one of the things I love about, not to get preachy here, but one of the things I love about Jesus is that his disciples came from this vast spectrum of culture. He had as his closest disciples people that others would think should not have been his disciples. He had women as some of his closest friends. He had zealots and tax collectors and very simple fishermen. You know, that he was seeing beyond the labels that people were putting on one another. And I think there's a real calling in our culture today that we have to see beyond the labels that we're posting on one another if we're going to move forward in this country. And that's what I want this cathedral to be, is sort of is very much in the similar sorts of way that you have done in your program, for this cathedral to be an honest broker for conversations where there aren't winners and losers, but where we see perhaps more deeply where one another is coming from on various positions.
I have the feeling that the women's movement, the Me Too movement, has created openings not yet fully realized, and that women who are on the ballots in record numbers around the country this year will indeed find a way to make a difference in that kind of listening. Frankly, and I say this with all humility, I think women grew up learning to listen more than to speak, and that there is a learning process going on among all of us, learning to open our ears, our minds, and our hearts, and we shall see if women are elected in large numbers to the Congress this year, what a difference that could make. I have my fingers crossed.
Tell us a little bit about you. If I'm correct, your family comes from Turkey. You're of Turkish descent, and did you grow up in an Orthodox household, Christian Orthodox household?
Yes, I was baptized in the Syrian Orthodox Church, which I found out later the Episcopal Church recognizes and accepts both the baptism, and I was confirmed here in the cathedral as an Episcopalian. I grew up in a fairly strict Syrian home. I was not allowed to ask questions.
You've been making up for it.
Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. What was pronounced was the law. And there was no dating until I was 16. And even then, my father stood at the door and interrogated every young man who came to the house. Perhaps many of you of my generation had that same experience, but my mother died at 49. My father died 11 months later of a broken heart. I met John Rehm at the Department of State. I was his secretary. He was an attorney. We were married for 54 years until he died of Parkinson's, having to starve himself, having to refuse all food, all medication, and water. And it took 10 days for him to die, which is why I feel so very strongly about an individual's right to choose death at a time when there is no hope. John Rehm could no longer feed himself. He could no longer stand on his own. He could no longer do anything for himself. And he said, I refuse to fall into further indignation.
Having been through all the things that you have been through, has your work always been a sustaining part of your life? Has it been something that's fed you all these years?
But you know, I was a homemaker for 14 years. I did not go to college. I came out of high school, went to work as a secretary, and work did not come to me until I was 37 years old. I stayed at home with those children and then began to volunteer at this tiny little radio station, WAMU, which then was not even part of NPR because it had only 2 employees full-time, and you had to have 5 employees to be part of NPR. The first fundraiser I ever did, we raised a massive total of $3,000 in a week. And our most recent fundraiser brought in $1.4 million. So you can see how we've had this tremendous growth. And I've been lucky enough to be part of it because I got in 1973 as a volunteer and worked my way up. 1979, I became host of the show, and it grew to 2.8 million listeners daily. I was very fortunate.
You know, when we think about listening, and sometimes when we really listen to someone, we're changed, and that's the wonderful thing about it. Can you think of an occasion in your, I'm sure there are many of them, but does one stand out for you where you were in a conversation with someone on your show and you came into the conversation with one opinion and you ended that conversation with a totally different opinion, where you were changed by someone's presence?
I think music affects me in such an extreme way. And there were times when one of my producers would say, oh, you have to have this musical group on. And I'd say, who are they? And of course, the young people on my staff knew exactly who they were. And I had no idea. So opening one's heart to those different approaches to life have really helped me, have helped me to see the world in a broader way than I think this whole experience of hosting this show has been absolutely remarkable for me. It was John Rehm who helped me to grow, to understand. My world was very small compared to his. He had been educated at Harvard and Columbia and knew the world as I did not. He was my greatest teacher. And I say that in memory of a marriage that lasted so long, and yet, like many here, was not without its difficulties. So I say to you that John was my greatest teacher and an extraordinary love. And I left that marriage after he died feeling as though I will never again be married. I will never again do anything but be on my own. And that was the title of my last book. And then what happens but John Hagedorn comes into my life.
Well, you know the old saying, if you want to make God laugh, just tell him your plans.
Now, I have a question for you because you have heard many, many sermons from the pulpit. Have there been one or two that have dramatically changed your thinking?
You know, that's a really interesting question. There have been preachers in my life. I think about Frederick Buechner in particular. I'm a big fan of Frederick Buechner, and both hearing him preach and having a chance to study with him and reading his works were dramatically life-changing for me as a young priest and even in college before going into the ministry. So
life-changing how?
Well, it was the way, if you've never read any Buechner, Buechner had a way of saying things that were eternally true and deeply powerful, deeply meaningful and powerful, but he had a way of saying them in not a simple way, but in a way that really resonated for his time period. I think that's the great challenge of all religion, whether it's Judaism or Islam or Christianity. It's sharing that faith, sharing the truth of that religion for each generation in a way that generation can hear it. And Buechner was one of those people for me, growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He was very present.
I think Maya Angelou did the same for me, helping me understand a life I could not possibly have imagined. And yet she came through with such strength and such glory. And what a life she lived.
Incredible.
The last conversation I had with her, I said, "Thank you, Dr. Angelou, for being with me." And she said, "Wait a minute, I want to say something." She said, "If you and I lived in the same town, I think we would be great friends. We'd sit, we'd have a glass of wine together, we would talk about what's happening in the world." Those were the last words she ever said to me, and I remember them.
What a gift that must have been.
What a gift.
And when you talk about preachers today, I got to put a plug in. Bishop Michael Curry, God bless him, is really bringing the heat,
Yes. He was really something. I could watch.
Although everybody thinks he's a Baptist from Chicago,
I know. I saw it, and I saw the faces of the clergy at that wedding, and I thought they are taken almost out of their seats by what he said. He was wonderful.
He was wonderful, and I never thought I would see an Episcopal priest, much less a bishop, on Saturday Night Live in a skit, you know, and that was...
How about that?
That was great. I was going to post it, and then I figured right after I saw it, I was going to post it on Facebook, and I thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that. And like half an hour later, he'd posted it, so I just love that.
Smart man.
Smart man, yeah.
Smart man.
Absolutely. Well, I can't thank you enough for your giving us your time this morning. You know,
Oh,
I would like to sit here and just talk with you about, you know, some of your favorite folks that you have sat with.
Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, Mr. Rogers, I know. And he was always been someone I've loved ever since childhood.
Absolutely.
And one of the most theological men in a very simple way. What a great gift he was to this country.
Do you know that when I had him on, he was in Pittsburgh playing the piano and in his studio, and at one point I said to him, Mr. Rogers, do you ever get sad? And he said, well, yes, I do. And he said, as a matter of fact, I'm sad today. And I said, well, why are you sad? And he said, because my stomach hurts. He was dead 3 months later of stomach cancer. And I, to this day, do not think he knew when he said that, because I don't think he would have said it if he had known. I've met his wife. I've dared not to ask her. But he was one of the best human beings I've ever had the pleasure of speaking with.
Amen to that.
Thank you.
And thank you, as you know, Mr. Rogers left an amazing legacy in this country, and thank you for the legacy that you're leaving and still creating for us in this country, and for your work and for being with us.
Thank
God
you.
bless you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.